Hello and welcome to today's Hangout. I'm Susan Woodcock with HomeDeckGal.com, and thank you for joining me today. We'll get started with the presentation. If you enjoy this class, I hope you'll visit my website at HomeDeckGal.com for more in-depth classes. I have handouts that you can purchase, recorded webinars, DVDs, on all topics for window treatments, pillows, and table skirts, and embellishments and drawing. I also have classes on craftsy.com, and those are filmed in HD. You can own them forever when you purchase them, so you might want to check that out. And there's a lot of free content like this presentation today that will be recorded onto my YouTube channel. If you own a custom workroom, I hope you'll think about attending the Custom Workroom Conference, which I'm presenting with my husband, Roger Walker, in February of 2016. We already have a lot of vendors signed up, and we announced the teachers last week. So be sure to visit customworkroomconference.com. And if you go on the website, you can sign up for a newsletter so that you can stay up to date on everything that's happening and find out when registration opens, which will be later this summer. So I'm going to start with today's presentation. And the topic is Interlined Blackout Roman Shade with Ribs, and an added bonus, no pinholes of light. And this is presented live, so let's hope everything works properly this time. I didn't have as good a luck on my last presentation, but I think we're doing okay so far. If you do have comments or questions, you can type those into the questions area. I did enable that. I don't see anything right now, but you're welcome to comment, or you can get in touch with me after the webinar. My email is susan@homedeckgal.com. So here are the details of the project that I'm going to show you today. It's one window. The finished size is 38 3/4 by 64 long, and it's an outside mount. And I've listed all the materials and supplies, including the trim, the lining, interlining, and the components used, and things like a board and Velcro and a staple gun and staples. All the resources that you would need to purchase these products are listed at the end of this presentation on slide number 24. So if you're viewing this again later and you just want to go straight to the resources, you can find those on the very last slide of the presentation. And this is a cotton print fabric. I used heavy flannel interlining. I did use the blackout lining from Hanes, and that is the cotton substrate blackout lining. And I used the ProLift shade system from Safety Shade, and that comes with all the components you need in the kit. And then general sewing supplies, an iron and needle and thread and sewing machine, that sort of thing. So before we start cutting and sewing and getting into the fun part of making this shade, why are pinholes of light a problem? This is the third in a series of webinars that I've done on eliminating pinholes of light and sewn Roman shades. And I keep playing around with this because it's so annoying when you spend a lot of time fabricating a shade and clients spend a lot of money on face fabric, and then there's the labor and the installation, and when it's all completed and hanging at the window, you see all these little dots of light where each ring was hand sewn to the shade. And many of you know that there's lots of techniques that you can use to eliminate pinholes of light, including a lot of adhesive products, iron-on rib tape, fusible hem tapes, even fringe adhesive and glues to do the hems, But when it came down to sewing on the rings, a lot of times it was really hard to eliminate that because you have to catch the face fabric. And when you pierce through the blackout lining, it creates a hole. And then you can't cover that hole up. You could, and some people do this successfully, glue little patches of blackout over all the holes. That's very time consuming. And you can also paint on gesso or whiteout or even a product called goop that you can purchase from some lining suppliers onto all the holes. But I don't know how long that would last at a very sunny, hot window where the shade is being lifted up and lowered down. The stress on all those little painted holes, they could flake away in the sun. So I've been looking at ways to sew Roman shades, not use adhesive products. There's nothing wrong with using adhesives in the workroom, and I do often, but a lot of my work is hand-sewn work. So that's why I'm trying to pursue these different techniques for hand sewing and making shades that are not using adhesive products and no pinholes of light. So here are the cutting allowances for this shade. Finished length plus 6 inches, and that's for the bottom hem and the board mount. And these are minimum allowances, so you have to allow in pattern repeats and a workroom allowance or a tabling allowance, which I usually add 2 inches to my cuts just because you might need to straighten something or you might cut wrong, so that little extra insurance. So these are minimum allowances. The finish width plus 8 inches for your side hems. For the blackout lining, finished length plus 2-inch allowance for the board mounting. And then the inner lining, finished length plus 4-inch additional for each foot of the length because I'm going to be sewing rib pockets into the interlining. The blackout lining will be flat and the inner lining will have the rib pockets sewn in. So you do need to allow 4 inches for each foot. And then for the width on the inner lining, just cut it out a few inches bigger than you need it to be because when you sew the rib pockets in, it can distort the size. So allow a little extra and then we're going to trim it down to fit later. For this shade and for my Roman shades, I like to use 2-inch doubled hems around the bottom and the sides. So that's the allowances that I've used. You might use a 1.5-inch doubled hem. So just adjust this for your style of shade making. So here we'll start the step-by-step, and I'm starting with cutting all the fabrics, set aside the lining, and then fold and press a 2-inch doubled hem in the sides and the bottom of the face fabric. If you're making a large shade, you'll have to match and seam together to join the fabrics, but this one fit for one width of fabric. So I'm pressing in the doubled hem around the sides and the bottom. And then I like to create a mitered corner at the bottom, and you can see how I've sewn that and trimmed away the excess fabric so it's nice and flat. You don't have to do a mitered hem at the bottom. You can certainly use a folded square hem at the bottom. And sometimes when I make shades, I have a doubled 4-inch hem at the bottom. There's a lot of techniques for shade making, and I combine them differently at different times for different projects. So the more you learn, the more you have in your arsenal of techniques that you can pull out what you need for the project that you have on the table that day. But this is a really nice finish, I think, for the hems of Roman shades. And I use this a lot. So it's a nice mitered hem. So I've folded in all the hems. I haven't sewn them or anything. And that's all ready to go. Now I'm taking the inner lining and I'm going to sew the pockets for the ribs in the inner lining. And this is something new. I had not tried this before. I always sew my rib pockets either in the lining itself or all the way through the entire shade, where you make a ribbed pocket shade where you see the horizontal stitching on the shade. So this was something new for me to try. It might not be a new technique or an original idea, but it's something that I hadn't tried before, and I really liked the way it worked. I did the spacing at 8 inches apart. You do want to have the spacing at 8 inches or less to meet the current corded window covering standards. And each rib pocket is a 1/2 inch finished to fit the plastic ribs that I'm using. If you're using fiberglass ribs, you might can use a smaller pocket. If you're using wooden dowels, you might want to have a larger pocket. So just figure that out before you start sewing all of your rib pockets. For this shade, the ribs at 8 inches apart, I started the first tuck, sewing the first tuck for the first rib 8 inches from the bottom. And this is to allow for a hem to show. When the folds fold down, they're 8 inches apart, so they fall down 4 inches to the front for each space. And I wanted the bottom of the shade to show because I have that pretty jute braid at the bottom. So my first rod pocket started up 8 inches from the bottom. If you wanted the bottom hem to end even with the shade folds as they fold up, then you would make that first rib pocket half of whatever your spacing is. So for this shade, I would have started the first rib pocket at 4 inches up from the bottom instead of 8. So that's all something you sort of need to adjust and work out in your workroom before you get started. After all the rib pockets are sewn, trim the inner lining to fit the shade to the exact finished width. So this is where you can see how it was important not to cut the inner lining to the exact size, because it does sort of stretch a little bit where each of those rib pockets is sewn. Much easier to trim it off even now. So now I have the hemmed face fabric face down on the table with the mitered corner, and it's all pressed and laid flat. And then the inner lining is placed on top, and all the edges have been cut even to finish even into the side hem. And the rib pockets are facing up, and I've pressed all the rib pockets with an iron so that they're flat and folded up facing towards the top. So they're all facing in the same direction. And then simply tuck the edges of the inner lining under the hems. And pin the inner lining to the face fabric under the bottom of each rib pocket. There really isn't an order to this. You see all the pins aren't lined up in rows or columns. It's just holding the fabrics together. And now here comes the fun part. This is the part of the method that I'm using to eliminate pinholes of light. I wouldn't use this technique if I was making a regular lined shade, although it would work fine, but it would be a little extra work. I don't want to pierce through the blackout lining to catch the face fabric, so I'm attaching the face fabric to the inner lining at this step. So I'm using what looks sort of like interlocking stitches that are used when you make English style drapery panel, where you interlock from the hem all the way up to the top. Except with this, I'm knotting. Every time I take a stab through to the face fabric, I'm going to knot the thread. So I'm starting at the right-hand side, I'm right-handed, and at the side hem, and then hand stitching the inner lining to the fabric below the rib pockets where I had the pins, moving horizontally across the shade and catching the face fabric. You don't need to worry about the placement of the stitches like you would if you were sewing on rings and had to have them all lined up. You just want to make sure that it's secured to the fabric. I used my left hand to measure. So a hand width apart is where I took a stab stitch to the face fabric and then knotted the thread and then kept going on to the next hand width apart, caught the face fabric, knotted the thread. Just be sure that you do not, because you want to make sure that it's catching the face fabric when the shade is lifting. You don't need to trim the threads in between each tack to the face because it's going to be blackout lined. You will not see those floating threads, and that makes it go a little faster. You can have a nice long piece of thread and just go across quickly, tack, knot, go to the next hand width apart, tack it, knot it, and keep going all the way across. After the hand stitching is complete, you can place the blackout over the back. And this was cut even with the finished width, and it'll fall even into the bottom hem. And too far, let's see, went one slide too far. There we go. So we should be on slide 13. So now that the blackout lining is in place, the inner lining is interlocked and secured to the face fabric. Now I'm going to mark for the ring placement on the back of each rib pocket. So when I sew on the rings, I'm going to be catching the inner lining that's in the rib pocket, not below the rib pocket. It'll be right on top of the rib pocket. So that's where I want to put the marks. I'm using the purple disappearing pen. And just as a little tip here, when you're marking for shade rings, I am terrible at math, and if I had to read the ruler every time I put a mark on the shade, it would just drive me crazy. So I just put a little painter's tape. I figure out the spacing, put some painter's tape with an arrow, and then as I'm placing that ruler up the shade, all I have to do is go 8 inches to 8 inches, and then use that arrow to place my mark. And with this shade, the rib pockets are spaced. The spacing's already figured out with the rib pockets, and you can feel them underneath of the blackout. So you just want to put your marks on top of the rib pockets. The horizontal spacing can be as you would do for any ribbed shade or dowel pocket shade. You don't have to have them quite as close together as doing a flat shade without ribs. So I think on this shade it was 8 and something, almost 9 inches apart. So you can go a little larger. You can go up to 12 inches apart on a ribbed shade. So after I marked all the rings, and I did that while it was nice and flat before I put the ribs in, but you could also insert the ribs and then mark for the rings. So there really isn't a perfect order here. The ribs are cut 1 inch less than the finished width. And I really like these hollow plastic shade ribs. They're so much easier to cut and use than the fiberglass ribs. I hate having to find little fiberglass fibers. You always find them when you start your next project and you wipe your hand across your work table and you get a splinter from the fiberglass ribs. I like these little plastic shade ribs. You can cut them with a pair of utility shears or scissors. So they're just very easy to use. And they're easy to join together because you can get splices that go on the inside of the shade rib. And you can throw a little glue in there and they splice together really securely. I cut the ribs 1 inch less than the finished width so they're not too tight into the edges of the shade. And then just fold back the edge of the blackout lining. I haven't finished the side hems yet. And just slide those ribs right into each pocket. And now can sew the shade rings on. You can use metal, nickel, brass, white plastic, or these are the clear forever rings from Safety Shade. They actually come with the shade kit. And they look great. I'm like these much better than the white plastic rings. They're also guaranteed not to split or break. So I'm sewing on the shade rings, and you could also use any lift system. You could use metal rings and ladder tape or a shrouded cord. So this technique of making a shade can apply to any finishing that you want it to do. But I'm using this Safety Shade system here. So I'm catching the rib pockets. The ribs are in there, so I can sew against that. I can feel that I'm not catching the face fabric. So the blackout lining is getting pierced by the needle, but it's catching on the back of that rib, on the back of the rib pocket. So the light isn't going to be able to show through to the front. And because the inner lining is tacked to the fabric, it all sort of holds itself together, sandwiched all together, and it all lifts up properly. So after the rings are on, I'm putting an aluminum bar into the bottom hem. And I do this a lot when I have this style of hem, when I have the 2-inch mitered hem. Sometimes I'll actually sew a pocket in and insert a weight bar, a steel bar, finished heavy weight bar. Kind of depends on the weight of the shade and the type of lift system you're using. If you need a lot of weight, this shade was pretty heavy all on its own. And the aluminum weight bar really does give a nice finish to the bottom, keeping the bottom hem of the shade nice and square. And then you can finish your side hems. I'm hand sewing and only catching the blackout lining, not sewing all the way through to the face, because again, if I pierce through the lining and then go all the way through to the face, I could have a pinhole of light showing. You could also use adhesive products to finish your side hems. One way you cannot finish your side hems at this point would be on a blind hemmer. You wouldn't be able to get the ribs under the blind hemming machine, and the rings would be in the way. So this is not a good choice if you're going to be using a blind hemmer. So you are sort of limited to either hand sew or use an adhesive product to finish the hems. And then I forgot to add the trim earlier, so I'm having to add the trim when the shade is finished. If I'd been smarter, I would have added it at the right point. So that's why you're seeing a photo of me adding the trim after the shade already has the ribs in it. And just using a little blue painter's tape to keep the distance of where I wanted the trim placed. And this was hand stitched onto the bottom. It was kind of difficult. This is one of those trims where it's not the easiest trim to hand sew. Good thing I didn't have a whole lot of it to use, but it did turn out really pretty. It was a perfect trim for this fabric. So now the trim is sewn on, all the rings are sewn on, the shade is completed, and I can measure the length. When I make shades, I always wait to measure the length until after all the rings are on and all the hems are in, and ribs if you're adding ribs, because there can be a little bit of take up, especially when you add those ribs in there. So you don't want to measure before you add the ribs. You want to wait till everything's finished. And then I fold over the top and press it. Allow enough for board mounting and trim away excess fabric. Staple it to the board and then finish the board so that there's no raw edges showing and that it's all neat and finished. And no staples showing either. And now I'm going to show you how to do a return flap. This is to hide the lift system. This is an outside mounted shade. So don't really want to see those end brackets for the lift system. And I used to always just staple a flap on onto the top of the board and then put the shade on, but it gets bulky at the corner. So a few years ago, I started just adding the return flap onto the front edge, and I would use double-sided adhesive tape. But then I went on an install, and I really wish that flap was not in the way because I couldn't get the screwdriver in there. So I've started adding Velcro onto the end so that when you go to install, you can zip that back and you can get in there with your screwdriver. So for this shade, the flaps are 5 inches wide and 6 inches long. You'll need to adjust that depending on your shade, how it's installed, what size your board is, and how deep your lift system is that's showing on the end. I used iron-on or fusible buckram, which is inserted into the little flap that I made and pressed and creased, and that makes a nice right angle so that your return flap stays nice and square. You can also use something like Seala Shaper, the wire adhesive, to hold the flap in place. That works great. You can also drop an L bracket into them if you would like to. That's maybe a little over the top for a little small flap like this, but that would work too. but let's just say if you dropped an L bracket in there, you wouldn't be able to fold it back open, so the Velcro wouldn't really be necessary. But I really like this. I think it turned out great. Most often I make a return flap where it's self-lined, but I did put blackout lining in this one because it is a blackout shade. You want to make sure that the light coming from behind the return flaps, that it's also blackout lined. So the front edge is stapled onto the front edge of the board, the front edge of the flap, and then the return wraps around. And that's how it looks when the lift system is installed. So you can see you can just unfold that off the board and then zip it back onto the Velcro. All the resources, again, just to remind you, for the lift system and the other products are listed at the end of the presentation. And the ring locks, rings, and level lock pieces that are sold by Safety Shade can also be used with any lift system that accepts 1.4 millimeter cord. You don't have to use the Safety Shade Pro Lift system. So if you want to use the RBS system, Textile, Rolly Company, Soft Shade Traversing Clutch, you can still use the rings and ring locks that are sold by Safety Shade. So here's the finished shade installed with L brackets. This is in the morning when the morning sun comes in, so it's the brightest time of day, and the lights are turned out so that if there were any pinholes of light, I'd be sure to see them, especially when the shade was all the way down in the down position. You can remember the slide I showed you at the beginning of the presentation. You could really see the pinholes of light shining through the part that I added at the bottom that wasn't sewn with the interlocking method and with the rings sewn on the back of the ribs. It's simply installed with L brackets onto the wall. And one thing I'd like to point out, and this is something that my husband said, because I installed this in my house as an experiment so that I could work with it and make sure it functions well. He said it looks like fluorescent lights are shining from behind the shade. And honestly, that's not that attractive. So you have this beautiful blackout shade that's blocking light, but look at all the light that's pouring in from behind the shade. So that's just something for you to keep in mind when you're selling blackout shades. When a client says they want blackout, you have to consider you might want to reverse mount the shade so it's against the glass. And probably want to recommend that you do a layered treatment. The only way you can do complete light blocking is to have something at the top, like a board or a valance or a top treatment, and side draperies and a blackout shade. That's the best way to get total blackout. So this is just a great example in this photo of showing you the light bleed that comes from behind a shade. And then I have some photos where the light isn't quite as bright. Just makes the shade look a little bit prettier. And you can see that it lifts up and down just fine with the ribs. The face fabric folds evenly, and the ring locks that are used with Safety Shade does allow for just a little bit of a waterfall, which is actually very pretty as it comes up on the window. And that's the end of my presentation today. So I promised it'd be about 30 minutes when I advertised this on Facebook. So I hope you've joined me, and maybe during your lunch break. And I thank you for attending. You're welcome to get in touch with me if you have any questions about blackout shades or any other home decor or sewing projects. Susan at homedecgal.com or 980-283-7115. And the resources are listed here for everything that I used in this presentation. Lining and interlining is from Hanes Fabrics. The fabric and trim came from Mary Jo's Cloth Store here in North Carolina. The lift system kit is from Safety Shade. The shade ribs and lift cord are from Textile. The staple gun and staples that I used were from Rolly Company. The hand sewing needles, thread, and buckram were from Wawak. And the weight bar and the board were purchased locally from my Lowe's store just down the street. I invite you to join me on online on all the social networking channels, Twitter, Pinterest, Facebook, Google+, LinkedIn, and on Craftsy as well. One of the things I love about being an instructor on Craftsy is that the platform is so interactive, and I really get to hang out with all the students and answer questions and see their projects. Home Deck Gal is a member of WCAA, so please check out WCAA.org for more information about how you can be part of the Window Coverings Association of America. So thank you so much for joining me today. The recording of this presentation will be on the Home Deck Gal YouTube channel, and I hope you'll check out the other methods for sewing blackout Roman shades. And I hope to see you again soon. So stay in touch and take care. Have a great afternoon. Bye. Bye.